happy to welcome Professor Lorraine DASTON, who is Director Emerita at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and visiting professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. So thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much, Paulius. My project concerns a puzzle, which is how the value of diversity became a value so astonishingly quickly in the political realm. The reason why it's a puzzle is that fundamental shifts in values are amongst the slowest of all social processes. Fashions change by the year, laws perhaps by the decade, political systems by the century. But in contrast, it took millennia for attitudes towards slavery to shift from almost universal acceptance in the ancient world to almost universal abhorrence in the modern world. Arguments usually precede an actual change in legislation and moral intuition. So, for example, arguments for the equality of women, in Europe at least, date back to the 17th century. But it took until the 20th century for legislation to pass, which gave them suffrage rights. And it is debatable whether the moral intuition of the equality of women has in fact rooted itself in the collective consciousness. Economics equality is another case. There have been advocates since the 18th century, but they have yet to cross even the threshold of legislation, much less that of a moral intuition that no longer needs to be debated, which is considered to be self-evident. So the breathtaking speed with which diversity established itself not only in argument and in legislation, but also as a viscerally felt moral intuition is nothing short of astonishing. This Google Ngram, which is based on the frequency of word usage in a corpus of about 5 million books, in this case in English, there's also corpora for French and German, to which I'll turn in a moment. It's a crude but suggestive indicator of when the meteoric rise of diversity as a political value began. So, starting in about 1970, the frequency with which the word appears in the Google Books English corpus of, as I say, about 5 million books rises. But a closer look at the book titles on which this sample is based shows that most of these references are to biodiversity. The books have titles like this. But starting in around the 1980s, the titles start to shift. Although biodiversity is still prominently represented, we start getting titles like this and like this. Both the shape of the curve for English language books and the dates of the inflection points tally with about a 5-year lag time with results for diversité in French and diversität in German. These results also suggest at least a rough periodization and also the direction of influence from the United States to Europe, as in the German case, in which diversity begins as an English import and then is naturalized as Diversität. And for those of you who are curious about the other elements of the triumvirate, égalité, fraternité, liberté in French, you see that in French, diversity very much tracks the curve of equality, whereas fraternité is not even close, but liberté, it should be said, surpasses them all. My question is how to explain what made the meteoric rise of the new political value of diversity possible. I'm also interested in what this tells us about the nature of value in general. But for the moment, I'll concentrate on just that question of why was it possible for this new value in the political realm to entrench itself so quickly and so thoroughly? I'll argue that the most recent incarnation of diversity in the political realm is drawing its self-evidence in part from earlier versions of diversity, first as an aesthetic value and later as an economic one. The kind of value diversity represented has shifted over time, as have the justifications for valorizing it. But each new version of diversity has piggybacked on its predecessors. So this prehistory of our current political value of diversity goes some way toward explaining how it went from being a trendy neologism in the 1980s to a self-evident good today. It's not an accident that biodiversity and cultural diversity are often twinned in current political debates. Since ancient times, the overflowing fecundity of nature, the sheer exuberant excess of its colors and its forms, has served as the premier example of diversity as beauty. For the Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, there was something wondrous and vaguely disturbing about the gorgeous but apparently pointless proliferation of flowers. In his Compendia Historia Naturalis, composed around 78 CE, he traced the beginnings of painting to artists' attempts to mimic and surpass their infinite variety. Pliny was quite puzzled by the phenomenon of the variety of flowers because he thought it served absolutely no purpose. And he concluded that flowers showed nature at play. Nature, he wrote, is in her most sportive mood, playful in her great joy, at her varied fertility. Almost 2,000 years later, when the German philosopher Immanuel Kant cast about for an example of beauty that commands admiration just because it serves no purpose and can be subsumed under no concept, his premier example was not painting, not sculpture, but flowers. Flowers were more than nature's own artworks. They also evoked the purest, freest aesthetic judgment. The enormous commercial and later imperialist expansion of Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries not only enriched gardens with imported exotica like passion flowers from the Americas or tulips from the Levant, they immensely expanded the variety of both natural and artificial objects available in bustling port cities like Lisbon or Amsterdam, and the aesthetic of diversity profits from this cornucopia of new objects. Here you see, for example, porcelain from China, a polished nautilus shell from the Indo-Pacific, displayed as luxury goods in the still life genre. One sees also similar blurrings of the works of art and nature in paintings like this one. This is Jan van Kessel the Elder's the Americas of 1666, which juxtaposes the flora and fauna of the Americas with the cultural productions and the people of the Americas. The aesthetic of diversity probably reached its apex in the 17th century Wunderkammer, zany predecessor of the modern museum, which jammed together oddities of every possible kind in this particular collection: narwhal horns, a stuffed Laplander, artifacts from the far north and the far south, and the obligatory stuffed crocodile on the ceiling. The aesthetic of diversity was intrinsically extravagant, intrinsically wasteful. It disdained all frugality. So it comes as something of a shock to find the value of diversity in the late 18th and early 19th century keeping the company of economic efficiency. This mid-18th century pin factory in Normandy is one of the most famous scenes in the history of economics. The image comes from the article épingle, pin, in Diderot's Encyclopédie, which opens with an evocation of the 18 separate operations which are required to make the common pin. From the arrival of coils of metal from Hamburg or Sweden to the sticking of the finished pins into a paper slip, a dozen at a time, the article lays out the manufacture of pins circa 1750, step by step. Staffed by experienced workers, this factory, which used only very simple machines, could be mind-spinningly efficient. It could turn out 48,000 pins in a day. Adam Smith read this article, and he opens his great treatise, The Wealth of Nations of 1776, with the pin factory as a shining example of how the division of labor promoted efficiency and technological innovation. The division of labor went on to have a spectacular career in the 19th century, well beyond economic and industrial applications. For example, it was the inspiration for Charles Babbage's design of the first computer, the analytical engine. And it was also the inspiration for Emile Durkheim's theory of organic solidarity in advanced societies. The principle could be as readily applied to the factory assembly line, the steps in a computer program, or to the differentiation of functions in a modern bustling city, like Paris, in which the cobblers make the shoes, the tailors make the clothes, the bakers bake the bread, etc. By the mid-19th century, the division of labor had become a keystone of political economy and almost synonymous with efficiency. But for our purposes, its most consequential application was to the life sciences, first to physiology and then to evolutionary theory. Specialization by task or function, as here, the métier de Paris, might produce efficiency, but it did not produce beauty. It was the biologists that brought together, very improbably, diversity as beauty and diversity as efficiency. The French physiologist and comparative zoologist Henri Milne-Edwards had been the beneficiary of the vast natural history collections during the 18th century, as well as of the efforts to make some classificatory sense in what seemed to be the infinite variety of organisms. Milne-Edwards was overwhelmed by this diversity. He said that it seemed to be the primary condition imposed on nature in the formation of animals. But beneath the prodigal variety of nature's forms, Milne-Edwards detected a fundamental organizational principle, the division of labor. When seized in the creations of nature, as in the industry of man, it is above all by the division of labor that perfection is obtained. So for Milne-Edwards, the human body, for example, or the body of any complex organism is like a factory. Each organ has its special function. The brain does not digest, the stomach does not think. It's Charles Darwin who read Milne-Edwards and brought together the principle of division of labor with speciation in his magnum opus, on the origin of species, in 1859. What one sees here is nature no longer a playground, but rather nature as an extremely efficient, savagely competitive economy. In this moment, Adam Smith's pin factory merges with Pliny's cornucopia of natural forms and gives us the idea of biodiversity. There's widespread agreement among scholars that the rise of diversity as a political value began in the United States in the 1960s with campaigns for equality. First and foremost, the civil rights movement to secure equal rights for Black Americans in the 1960s, and then in campaigns very closely modeled on the civil rights movement, for example, the campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment to guarantee the equality of women. By the way, an amendment never passed. All of these movements marched under the banner of equality for all citizens, regardless of race, gender, or sexuality, and all of them fortified their claims to equal treatment in a democracy with demographic arguments. So the argument ran something like this. If Black Americans constitute 12% of the American population, then ideally they should be represented at 12% amongst business executives, university students, civil servants, etc. But even if the principle of equality for these groups gained general acceptance, the programs that were designed to enforce these principles were politically controversial, especially if they involved quotas, positive discrimination, or affirmative action. After a number of landmark United States Supreme Court decisions struck down affirmative action as unconstitutional, a new specialty emerged, namely diversity management, replacing affirmative action in both the public and private sectors. So in the United States, diversity had decisively edged out equality in policies and mission statements by the 1990s. In the European Union, this had happened by 2012 when the directives to member states begin to include diversity. European countries with strong corporate ties to the United States, such as Germany, were in the vanguard of adopting both the new language and the new measures. And you can see this. Diversity is not a German word, and German has a perfectly good word, Verschiedenheit, for this, Mannigfaltigkeit. But you see here that initially the English word is imported into German, diversity, until a new word is coined, Diversität, clearly modeled on the English word. This clearly shows the direction of travel, of influence. But I don't wish to exaggerate the influence of US developments. Other arguably more momentous political events elsewhere in the world surely prepared the way for the astonishing success of diversity as a political value. And here I can give only one example, but one which attracted worldwide attention. After the first democratic election of 1994 that elected Nelson Mandela as president of South Africa, Archbishop Desmond Tutu declared that South Africans were the rainbow people of God. Now, Tutu meant this as a religious symbol. He was evoking the rainbow that sealed the covenant between God and humanity after the biblical flood. But Mandela adapted the phrase to more civic ends and underscored the multiracial associations of the multicolored rainbow in his first presidential address. He said, "We enter into a covenant that we shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world." This is the moment when rainbows became the emblem of diversity everywhere. Shadowing this value of diversity in the political realm was both the value of economic efficiency. It was argued plausibly by psychologists, sociologists, even philosophers, that diverse teams could, by a combination of perspectives, by a division of labor, achieve better results than more homogeneous ones. But also the value of diversity as beauty was present in these evocations. In another speech, Nelson Mandela evoked not only the rainbow, but the flora of his native land. Each of us, he said, is as intimately attached to the soil of this beautiful country as are the famous jacaranda trees of Pretoria and the mimosa trees of the Bushveld. A rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. So, nestled at the heart of the political value of diversity still lies the splendor of the flowering meadow. Diversity is beauty. Standing on the shoulders of the older values of diversity, the irresistible rise of the value of diversity as justice is perhaps not so mysterious after all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting. Any questions from the audience?
I think Sophie Roux has a question.
All right. Yes, please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yes.
Okay, so it's just a small question and a big, as it were, remark. The small question is, how do you explain the decline of the word diversity after 2010? Because in all the diagram and diagram you showed us, we could see this decline. So that's the question. And then I mean, thank you for this huge overview of your question. But I was wondering if it's a change in the domains in which diversity is applied, or a change in the very notion and value of diversity. Because, for example, in what you called economic diversity, efficiency, it seems to me that there is something that you don't find in the two other kinds of diversity, which is that there is a division of labor because there is a principle of organization and there is a kind of unique goal, for example, the organism or the factory, so that we have this kind of unity which is aimed at by the division of labor. Can
Yes.
you see what
Yes.
I mean? So
I do see what you mean. Yes.
So that's an example to make it short. But the question is, does it change from one domain to the other, but with the same structure, or is it a change in the value itself?
Thank you. Right. So first of all, the dip in 2010, I can only hypothesize. It's something that I noted as well. I think the only way really to settle this question is to look at the corpora of Google Books to see what the basis is for that dip. However, I would note that starting around 2010, you begin to notice critiques of diversity from both the left and the right of the political spectrum. So from the left of the political spectrum, it's a critique on the basis of universalism. Diversity is the granting of political status because of certain characteristics which distinguish one person from another or one group from another, whereas equality is granted to what is common to all human beings, regardless of their distinguishing features. So that's the argument against diversity from the left. The argument from the right is what we are seeing in the United States at the moment, is that the principle of diversity is contrary to the principle of meritocracy. But this is a hypothesis. I think the only way really to answer your question is to dive very deep into the Google corpus. Your second really interesting remark, I agree with you. I think that every time diversity shifts its residency, as it were, to another domain of values, it changes to some extent its associations. What doesn't change is the fact that it is still echoing and drawing upon for its support the older values of diversity. So that in the case, for example, of the political value of diversity, there are many arguments made which are purely based on the division of labor and economic efficiency. So it became very popular among businesses in the 2010s to promote diversity on the principle of the division of labor, that one would, especially as firms expanded to global markets, have people whose ethnic background meant that they had specialized language and cultural skills, which would help the company relate to a new market for their commodities. And you see very similar arguments for standpoint epistemology in the philosophy of science. The reason I brought up the Mandela speech about the jacaranda trees, which he repeats over and over and over again, is that the aesthetic is also there in the background. And I feel that the choice of the rainbow as an emblem for these movements is not accidental.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I had Lisa who wrote to me internally, and then we will have Sadi and Alieno.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Lorraine, for the talk. I really enjoyed. I have a small question, but listening to your previous answer, I was thinking it may be very poorly framed, so apologize in advance. I was wondering about potential differences according to different national contexts in terms of the reason why the term may have the resonance that you want to analyze, and especially in the French context, I was thinking of a sort of attractiveness of indirection, if I can put it this way, because as you know, there's a certain reluctance in France to address ethnic and racial questions. So that if that could be a reason why diversity as a value would be taking the significance that it has, if you see what I mean.
Yes, I absolutely see what you mean. Some of my earlier work was on the history of statistics, and it's really notable that France, that INSEE, for example, does not collect ethnic statistics because of very strongly held principles of universalism. This is absolutely a story, especially in the last chapter, diversity as a political value, which is inflected by national culture, in part because diversity itself is very diverse, and groups which are considered to be marginalized groups and therefore the targets of ameliorative action differ depending on the history of the country. So in the United States, it's obviously in many ways a dialogue about race, whereas in a country like Germany or other Central European countries, it's often a discussion about the Roma, for example. Whereas in countries which have a colonial past, it's about immigrants from those former colonies. So yes, this is definitely a history which is inflected by national context, which makes it all the more striking that despite those differences, there are broad parallels in the emergence of the value and its acceptance.
Thank you.
Great. And Sadi next.
Well, thank you very much, Lorraine, for something illuminating. I loved your Darwinian description as nature as a savagely efficient economy. But it feels like there's something fighting against diversity, right? Like everybody seems to say that nature is diversity, and in principle we should accept it very well. But there seem to be forces against that, especially recently politically. And I was wondering if one of these forces against it is that diversity means complexity and difficulty to manage this complexity, and maybe, for example, the attempt of considering this as labor division was trying to find a unifying principle. And so what is your feeling that what opposes diversity in our societies? What is it that doesn't make it something that goes naturally?
Right. So I think there's absolutely nothing natural about diversity. I think that there are several opposing forces to diversity. In my answer to Sophie Rous's question, I mentioned critiques from both the political left and the political right. At the moment, the political right, especially in the United States, has the spotlight. But for a very long time, the political left has been uneasy with the value of diversity because they see it as a rival to the value of equality, and they consider equality to be the more fundamental value. But there are also purely practical concerns, which Lisa's question about the diversity of diversity in different national contexts raises. If you've ever had to serve on a committee for your university faculty or any other group which is supposed to implement diversity policies, you realize that the definition of who gets to count as diverse is a battleground. And that, too, I think, has been a source of resistance. It becomes anything but one of those rainbow street pageants and much more like a Hobbesian war of all against all. And I think the final source of resistance has been the sense very much inherited from biodiversity, which is that your identity is your destiny, that just by dint of the accident of who you happen to be, you have a fixed perspective, and that perspective is as unchanging as if you were a biological species. And I think, understandably, that implicit assumption evokes resistance.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Aliena next.
Hi, Lorraine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a very short question as I'm curious about the connection you may want or may not want to make between diversity and its political version, which is pluralism. Do you think?
Sorry, what was the last word? To
pluralism.
Pluralism, thank you. Mm-hmm.
So would you make a connection between diversity and pluralism as a democratic virtue, which is endangered today with threats on illiberalism or this kind of narrowing of the political spectrum?
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, I think that these are values that are operating at different levels. As I mentioned a moment ago in response to Sadi's question, diversity tends to be applied to individuals and groups. Pluralism is also applied to groups in a democratic society, but it's also applied probably more centrally to pluralism of opinions. So there is a view, no matter what your identity in the sense of diversity may be, you may differ from other members of your group. There may be a plurality of views. For example, within the community of Catholics, let us say in France, there may be a plurality of views with regard to birth control and other such policies. So diversity tends to entrench itself either in individual or group identities, whereas pluralism is a much more capacious category, which also includes a kind of John Stuart Mill marketplace of ideas, differences of opinion and position.
Thank you, and Willy.
Okay, thank you very much for the beginning of the conversation. So I have 3 specific questions that there are broader transformations that accompany the transformation of diversity. Maybe the most important is that we went from equality to equity, which means equality of opportunities to equality of outcomes, and that this is one of the most problematic DEI components. And then the other thing I wanted to add is that there is also the problem between, of course, pluralism as the integrated respect of minorities and the incorporated participation of minorities, but there is also polarization and fragmentation, which, and I would like to know if, do you have any thoughts on the links between equality, equity, fragmentation, and diversity? Because I think that the ways that it's being framed changes according to these other terms.
Right. I absolutely agree with you that the shift from equality to equity is in many ways the most significant of that triumvirate of diversity, equality, and inclusion, and the most controversial. And I think it's linked to your second point about fragmentation. Equality of opportunity might presume a competitive society, but it is basically a view about a level playing field and a variety of possible outcomes. And it's not just compatible, it goes hand in hand with a meritocracy. Whereas equity is about equality, as you say, of outcomes. And if you are in an economic period, which is the period after 2008, the financial crisis, in which you think that the resources of the society are not just static, but actually contracting, then the idea of equity of outcomes becomes a matter of existential dispute, because some group's gains will inevitably be seen as another group's losses. So if you have a situation, a happy situation, in which you have prosperity, an expanding economy, and with commensurate expanding opportunities, I don't think the fragmentation is inevitable. But that is not the world we live in after 2008.
All right, thank you. And David.
Yes, thank you it's a very inspiring presentation. I have a couple of questions. The first is on chronology, and it is if there is a an increase in the use of the term diversity after 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the fall of the communist systems. Because one of the reproach that were made against the communist system was that there was a form of equality that canceled the difference and individuality. And the other is more about the fact that in this moment, diversity is it's quite under attack as a political value, and so the question can be this: I mean, diversity applied to human beings is a notion that interacts and sometimes is almost synonymous with other notions, like foreigner, like enemy, like. So how could be interesting to how much could it be interesting to see the relationship between diversity and other words. And diversity respect to which characteristic at the extreme, and this is something that it's very much important, I think, in the political arena now. Diversity could be pushed until saying that someone is not even human. So maybe there are some nuance in the use in the political uses of the term diversity that should be analyzed. And one last curiosity is about your research history. That's finished.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really interesting. It is indeed the case that if you just look at that very crude indicator, the Google Ngram, you do begin to see the slope of the curve rising much more steeply after about 1990. So there may indeed be a connection. At the moment, I can only say correlation, but it's a very interesting hypothesis. The second question concerning derogatory words for the other, I think that is the brilliance of the rainbow metaphor. Especially in the South African context, absolutely the many terms for people who were other than the white Afrikaners were derogatory terms. They were terms of pejorative terms and terms of insult in many cases. The rainbow, no one thinks that the colors of the rainbow are in any kind of hierarchy. And moreover, and this goes back to Sophie Ruth's really good point about the organic unity, the mixture of the colors is pleasing. It's even more pleasing than just one of those colors by itself. So the link that Tutu and Mandela make between a multiracial society and the rainbow serves to defang that strategy of othering within diversity. And it shows the work that's being done by the value of diversity as an aesthetic value in the political realm.
All right. Thank you so much. This is all the time we have for this section. So thank you so much, Professor Daston, for your talk and everyone for your questions.